Hello and welcome to iBridged Leadership Stories. I'm your host, Jeff Harnois. I'm very pleased today to introduce you to Anya Eremenko, a 11-year Google veteran focused on high-performing partnerships at Google. During Anya's time with Google, she was leading strategic partnerships with YouTube and YouTube Health, Google Cloud in the healthcare and life sciences space, and partnerships in the strategic health search function. Before that, she was global head of business development at Skype and head of strategy and finance at eBay for Gumtree. In addition to some of that fantastic experience, Anya holds an MBA from INSEAD and a Bachelor of Science degree from Berkeley. And she also has completed some executive education at Harvard. Please join me in welcoming Anya to iBridge Leadership Stories.
Hi,
Anya, it
Jeff.
is so
Thank you
nice to
for
see
that
you.
intro.
No, thank you very much. It is so nice to see you. When we think about big brands, I'm going to jump right into it if that's okay. When we think about big brands like Google, we often think about Google search. That's sort of what it's famous for, and then obviously the ads business. But you were very focused on partnerships in a variety of different divisions at Google. Can you talk about that a little bit? Give us a little bit of an overview of that.
Yes, of course. So, for a company of that scale, partnerships often enable either product partnerships, which I was focused on, enable development of products at a bigger scale or provide necessary inputs for product development, or distribution partnerships. So partnerships essentially allow a company like that to scale to
Hmm.
certain market segments or to certain verticals like health. Because, for example, in health, Google is never going to build up the expertise that Mayo Clinic or Harvard could provide, but we could partner with them to bring that content to the users.
And I think in previous conversations that we've had about, especially in the Google Health sector, the partnerships were so strategic because of the subject matter expertise that your partners were actually bringing to that ecosystem. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, of course. This is what's tricky about vertical specific partnerships because unless you have that specific expertise yourself, you have to understand the value of different parties that they bring to the table. And in health search, for example, in Google search, I started before we had our first MD employee. So what you have to do is ramp up pretty quickly and understand what are our users looking for and what information exists there, and how do you bridge that gap. So in that case, for example, what people are looking for, one of the things we found out is that half of the searches are caregivers. So it's somebody
Ah,
searching for their child or their elderly parent, and for those searches they care about specific, do I give Tylenol, ibuprofen, kind of more specific information, versus, if it's a rare disease and you want more information, things like that. So understanding what the user needs are is
mhm,
very important to then figuring out what do we want to build a partnership upon.
mhm. I think about that caregiver component. When I was raising my children, we didn't have resources like Google. In fact, the internet didn't really exist back then. And thinking about the wealth of information that's available now so that caregivers can, in fact, be more effective in giving care seems like a really important gift to humanity.
It did feel like a worthwhile mission. And what I loved about working at Google and at YouTube and in cloud is the scale of the impact, that you put one piece of information out and a billion people would see it,
Oh,
literally a billion, which just
yeah.
feels very good. But it also means that information has to be 100% correct and accurate and up to date.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such an interesting relationship between what you were doing and the point of it, which was to do it at scale. One small mistake has the potential, at least, of being having some very, very large implications on a global basis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which brings me to my next question, and it's really trust. When we think about leadership development and the focus of what iBridged does, Trust is always a foundational component. Learning how to operationalize it, making sure that it's, it is a strategic additive to relationships. But when you think about partnerships and partner ecosystems, tell me a little bit about that from a trust perspective.
Absolutely. Yes. And in developing, I love that you use that word ecosystems because that's exactly how we were thinking about that. So each partnership was not just transactional, but
Mm.
a part of a bigger picture where, in order for it to be valuable and sustainable, it needs to bring something for both parties. You need to be able to communicate the value proposition of the partnership very clearly. And in some cases, well, in all cases, actually, building trust is essential because for these more complex, more strategic partnerships, where it's not just kind of goods for money exchange, where you're building something together, you're potentially co-developing products, you're potentially putting both of your brands on something jointly. There
Mhm,
needs to be trust that, for example, just as we spoke earlier, that information will always be updated and correct, that
mhm,
quality assurance exists, and so on. And in my experience, of course, for me, trust always starts with personal relationships. So
mhm,
understanding who the decision makers are, both on my side and on the partner side, in understanding how they think about their ecosystem, their growth,
mhm,
what do they value over the next 3 to 5 years, and how do we contribute to that? Again, both with internal executives and external, because a lot of these partnerships are in resource intensive and money intensive, and as well as closing that partnership with the partner, you also need to be able to explain internally why we're spending these resources on something that might not have a very clear ROI within a year.
mhm,
So building trust, I think, comes from understanding where the parties are coming from, communicating very clearly. And I think as the relationship develops, there are always issues that come up. There's always some obstacles or maybe even conflict. And how you work through that either destroys trust or further builds trust. So,
mhm,
anticipating issues, being transparent, not shying away from hard messages, but delivering them with a solution, right? That I
mhm,
think this could be an issue, but I think we could solve it in this way or that way or that way.
mhm.
I think that helps establish trust.
And so, what I heard there, or some of the things that I heard there, was that interpersonal level, the relationship component in partnerships, but also when you have to have, difficult or hard conversations, that you not only address maybe some of those issues, but that you approach that from a solution orientation. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yes, I think that's very important, especially the more senior you get in your role, is that not only you anticipate issues, but you come up with at least a few, two or three options for how it could be solved and addressed.
Mm,
And it's, a common phrase at Google was bring solutions, not problems.
love
Meaning,
that.
if you bring
Yeah.
a problem, also anticipate what the potential solution is, because individuals are empowered to have autonomy and make decisions, and they're trusted to know their area of expertise. When I was working on health, for example, nobody that I reported to had any medical background, right? So it was
Mhm.
up to
Right.
me to kind of gather the necessary opinions from external, internal medical experts and come up with an evaluation of what we should be doing.
We talked about what sounded like to me a category that I would call ownership. And I have to tell you, that is a focal theme of what iBridged is doing now with our large clients, is really helping move ownership, which also means decision making, down in the organization and as close to the customer, whether they're internal or external, as possible. And it sounds like you had a lot of autonomy and ownership in the partnership world at Google. Can you tell me about some of the bigger partnerships that you were successfully able to secure?
Absolutely, yes. And that's, I think, what Google used to be known for, and maybe still is. Obviously, I've been away from Google search for a few years, being in cloud and YouTube, but it's that autonomy and ownership and the atmosphere of trust in your decision making. And I think for example, one of the partnerships that we needed to establish to launch Health Search in the US was a trusted consumer healthcare brand. So one of the most trusted, if not the most trusted brands in the US is Mayo Clinic. And I did need to provide kind of some backing from that US News of World Report, kind of some, but it's kind of understood to anybody that, of course, Mayo Clinic is top of mind for anybody. That's kind of,
Mhm.
if your parents got sick, where would you take them? That's kind of the best of
Mhm.
the best. It has that brand. And obviously, Mayo Clinic knows that. They know
Right.
that they are the best brand. So they are careful, rightfully so, about what kind of partnerships they create. And when it came to working with a tech company, they were understandably cautious. And
Mhm.
one of the side effects was that the partnership took much longer to conclude than we initially planned, right? So we planned that it would take a few months, and it took close to a year. And I needed trust from my organization to proceed, to keep going, and to not give up and jump into a partnership with maybe a lesser known brand, but the one that would be quicker to work with. So that was one of the things we've had to figure out how to agree on. And then, of course, resource investment, whether it's people or money, is always something that you have to negotiate internally, because you need to provide some sort of ROI or justification for why is this a good investment and why is this partnership a better investment than another partnership.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's probably hard for people to understand the significance of creating and managing partnerships when world-class brands are involved. And then I think about it from the perspective of we have a technology company on one side of this partnership, and technology is generally pretty fast-paced and innovative and has a high risk tolerance profile. And then the other partner is one in healthcare where there's an extreme amount of due diligence and maybe even re-diligence to make sure that the first diligence was done correctly to mitigate risk, because there's a pretty high risk aversion profile. And just managing those two perspectives again from a partner standpoint and the ability to still bring those organizations together, that's a pretty significant accomplishment from my perspective. Well done and congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I have to also imagine, Anya, that because of the, let's call them cultural differences, the high stakes of big brand partnerships, there must have been some conflicts that you had to manage. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, exactly something you just alluded to a couple minutes ago, which is in tech, the culture is launch and iterate because it's software. You
Mhm.
launch a piece of code, it doesn't do what you want, you relaunch it. Healthcare is the opposite. You do a lot of testing and you
Mhm.
only launch when you have evidence. Our medicine is evidence-based, right?
Mhm.
So we had an issue in this partnership that we were just talking about, for example, where the Mayo Clinic wanted to see what will it look like, what will the final product look like, and we could show them mock-ups, but we couldn't say this is exactly what it's going to look like, because when we launch, the layout might change, it might go here, it might go there, and that was not okay. It was
Right.
not acceptable. There needed to be more than a wireframe. And in a way, it was good because it pushed our team to think much more deeply about this product and how it will look, and that, you know, the prevalence data for a condition comes from the CDC and the treatment information comes from the FDA. So it comes from government sources. It pushed us, well, pushed me to approach those organizations as well and establish those partnerships. And it forced us to think more deeply than we normally would before launching an information product, which, you know,
Mhm.
information is fluid, it changes. But on the other hand, I've also had to push the partner in this case to be comfortable with some ambiguity, even just going to their website and saying, you know, you've published these articles, but if this changes, you will take it down. And it's not like you're publishing a book. Things can change and adapt. And in the end, what we ended up doing is in the agreement, we had a paragraph that we added that specifically said that we, Google, promise to keep the information updated as the medical knowledge evolves, because it does evolve. New things
Mhm.
happen, new viruses spring up, treatments get updated.
New and
So it
emerging
pushed.
research.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it pushed both sides to be better. But another thing that I think helped is listening to their concerns and responding with something that addressed their concerns. So, for example, Google was very interested in launching information about 100 or 200 conditions that were responsible for the bulk of the search, because most things that people search are common things like flu or cold or asthma, right? And those are pretty well established concepts where prevalence and medical knowledge is well established.
Mhm.
So anything beyond that required additional agreements, additional reviews.
Okay. Okay. And you mentioned the government component to this, which I hadn't considered before. And so now we have a technology organization, again, release and iterate a medical, a world-class medical brand, test and build evidence before release. And then we overlay the bureaucracy of the federal government on top of the partnership. What an unbelievably complex soup you're cooking up here. Can you talk a
Thank
little bit about the complexity of all of those, gosh, just the complexity of work pace for me. Government moves at a snail's pace. Healthcare moves, something faster than that, but still not at the pace of technology, and just trying to manage all of those variables. In fact, let me put that in the form of a question. When you think about all of the variables of the various entities, how do you approach that strategically to wrangle and gain alignment there?
Yes, very good question. And I'm laughing because I think all great consumer products, as you know from your background in Apple, have an enormous amount of complexity behind them. If it's
Mhm.
easy to use and everything works, it's because there are 100 things stitched together on the back
Right,
end to make it
right.
seamless, right? So in this case, I am laughing because my manager that I'm still friends with used to kind of laugh because every time she would walk into my workspace, I had a whiteboard with top 3 to 5 things that needed to happen that week. And it
Sure.
just helped me focus. These are the
Yep.
things that will make the boat go faster. So if
Right.
I'm not getting an answer from the CDC, it's, find street new contacts or go cold on LinkedIn or find somebody at Google who knows somebody at the CDC. And if it's, getting legal framework for somebody that would make them comfortable with signing up with us, it's, getting to the top of the list for the legal team that week. And she thought it was funny because whenever she came in to kind of ask how is your progress, she could just see it on that whiteboard. Okay, that's what you're doing, that's where you are. And things
Mhm.
that were like checked off, sometimes it was a tricks, like things that need to happen, like the 5 steps with this partner and 5 steps with this partner. But I think being very proactive, being an owner, being a leader is the mindset you have to have. And also, I think understanding that things will never go according to plan. If I could pick up the phone, call somebody, and they sign the agreement, I would not have a job. It would be a click to accept contract online, right?
Mhm.
So before, and it took me a few years in partnerships before I started even saying this and kind of planning it out with my executives that in order for us to do this, we probably need these many months because there will be this and there will be this exchange and we'll have to exchange term sheets. And once we agree those, we'll need to put a legal framework around them. And then we need to figure out this and then we need to go back with product. So it's kind of like being a movie director a little bit, right? Is getting all the pieces aligned, on the right days with the right lighting.
I love that movie director analogy because it is a movie director is when you sort of peel back the Hollywood, substar, if you will, because a lot of directors are sort of stars in their own right. You realize that there's a craft mastery in place here. It's not only managing the script and managing the actors, it's managing 1,000 other resources from lighting to sound to catering to set design to wardrobe. And so partnerships, I often think are, very similar to that, in that you've got the big and easily identifiable moving parts. And then there's probably, an infinite number of smaller variables that have to be managed. Is that right? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think what was great about Google search is that partnerships was its own organization,
Hmm.
because partnerships was its own career track. Because if
Mm.
it was embedded within engineering or product, it would be really hard for those leaders to understand, why is it taking 3 months for you to just get somebody to sign something? But
Hmm.
this complexity was understood so well that it was its own org, it was its own standards and career management and so on.
Yeah, and I think that's also an interesting observation. It could be a function of engineering. It could be a function of product. But partnerships, I think, probably require a much higher degree of interpersonal, let's call it sophistication and nuance. There's a lot more relationship development and probably a lot more negotiation that goes in, when it's a pure partnership play versus, letting some of the other organizations lead that initiative. Is that a fair assumption?
It is, and I think it also depends on the type of partnerships, right? Like if it's a technical technology licensing versus content licensing versus
Mm,
a co-development of product. And it also depends if it's a pilot where you're trying to test something
yeah,
small, very
yeah.
discreet, where, an engineering team could do that, versus you're scaling, where you're building health search, for example, and you need a variety of partnerships. You start in the US and then you need to repeat that process in India and Brazil and so on. So understanding also the maturity of the partnership, is it just a pilot, or are you in the phase where you're scaling? Or are you in the phase where it's just business as usual and you're in a kind of QBR and like slower growth stage where another
Mhm.
organization actually manages that?
Mm.
So I think it's kind of an intersection. I always think of it as like complexity, topic, and stage.
And then you touched on something, Anya, that again, it's like I hadn't really thought of that. We've got tech company, we've got governmental agencies, we've got world-class healthcare. That's all external. And then on the internal side, you've got engineering, you've got product, you've got legal, you've got marketing, you probably have some sales folks. All of those internal, I think of them as internal clients. And then you go to scale on a global level, which now means localization in all of the languages, all of the countries, all of the global markets. What an unbelievably large and complex initiative. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a busy few years.
I bet. I bet. Wow, I'm so impressed. I'm so impressed with anyone's ability to sort of see and understand the strategic aspects of an initiative like this, and then be able to successfully manage all of the different players and personalities to a successful outcome. I'm so impressed with that. Since I mentioned personalities, let's talk a little bit about that. I know that you have experience and exposure in Myers-Briggs. That's, of course, one of my favorite psychometrics out there, along with DISC. How do you think about using psychometric profiling in the world of partnerships? How did it help or enable, if at all, in the work you were doing there?
Absolutely. So, first of all, I'll just say that for me personally, I'm an ENTP, which I think makes me perfectly suited to this
Mhm.
type of work, strategic partnerships, multiple moving parts. No 2 days are alike. I thrive in that kind of environment.
Right,
Um,
right in what I would call your center lane.
yes. And what I love about Myers-Briggs is that it does not predict everything. Obviously, it has its limitations, but it gives you some information on what how will this person make decisions? What do they need to make a decision? Do they need kind of an intuitive feeling? Do they need to talk about it? Do they need to read something over the weekend? With executives, it's really helpful to understand how do they take in information and how do they reach a decision, to give them everything that they need and not give them things. If somebody wants to have a 15-minute call to talk about it live and you send them a 50-page document, it's just going to annoy them They don't want to read the document. They trust that you've read the document. They want to ask you a few questions, right? Versus another person might have the opposite, where they just want to thoroughly review all the information.
Mm.
It also helps in running meetings, especially large meetings. So again, huge generalization, but introverts tend to hold back and not interrupt and ask questions when there's space for that,
Yeah.
whereas extroverts tend to just kind of talk over each other. So I think if you're running a large meeting and you need to get input from everybody rather than just present, it's important to pause every once in a while and to ask specific questions, not kind of
Yeah.
how's everybody doing, but do you think that this is the right way to think about ROI? Let's
Yeah.
take 5 minutes and please tell me what you think. And I think also with socializing, because of course you end up socializing with your colleagues and your partners, to understand how people like to socialize outside of work. Some people prefer to have a lunch, some people prefer to go out after work, some people have they're not super comfortable in large groups and they prefer to be in a smaller group. So it was building relationships in general. I feel like it helps to keep in mind where people are coming from,
Mm.
how they see the world, because I feel like everybody has almost like their own lens on the world, and what do they see, what's important to them, what did they want to get out of it.
I love that observation because I completely agree with it. The way that I typically frame this is we are all transmitting information and data, 100% of the time, every day. And if you're able to tune into that individual's frequency, you can receive the signals that are being sent. But if you don't have that receiver that's tuned into that frequency, very likely the information that's being sent never gets through. And I see a lot of what I would call interpersonal breakdowns that lead then to conflict simply because people are not speaking each other's languages. They're transmitting and receiving on different frequencies and the signals are just not getting through. And you kind of alluded to this a little bit. The example you gave was somebody who was looking for maybe more of a summary type, and then they wanted to have an engagement with you versus somebody who wanted the whole plan in advance that they could read through, look through, and then have a conversation with you. Those are very, very different approaches. And in fact, if you treat everybody the same along your own bias, let's say you're a bigger picture, more strategic thinker, and that's all you send to people, those people who want the detail are going to be unsatisfied with that response. And then conversely, the example you gave, you send everybody, you treat everybody the same, you give everybody that, 50-page document with detail, and the person who really just needed the summary is going to be unsatisfied with that. And so the ability to be able to read individuals and understand what their frequency is, I think Myers-Briggs is an excellent tool for helping people connect, communicate, and collaborate on a much higher level.
Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about a couple of things that I ask all of my guests. The first one is when you think back from a leadership standpoint, the things that have informed you, when you think back to advice that people have given you, coaching, counseling, whatever it is, over the course of your career, what is the best piece of advice that you didn't take and wish that you had?
Yes. I think the best piece of advice was to take more risks in my career. So when I was starting out in my career, I took risks all the time, partially because you have less to lose, and partially because I just really wanted to end up in a place where I was fulfilled career-wise. So I started in finance, that wasn't quite it. I did some strategy, it wasn't quite it. And once I got into tech partnerships, especially working on health, I just felt like I hit my lane, and that's exactly what I was passionate about. I
Mm.
love partnerships, I love tech, I love healthcare. The intersection of those three things was
Mm.
just amazing. And but you're never fully cooked, right? It's not like you found that career lane and you're done and you just cruise in that. There's still things that change. So I think a career coach actually gave me this advice when I was transitioning, I think, from Google Cloud to YouTube. And she was saying, but think about things outside. Don't you want to take a jump into something a little bit closer to tech and closer to actual healthcare outcome that you seem to care about, because the YouTube role was more about information, less about kind of health outcomes and more about public health and information. It was during COVID also. And not taking the risk, just having fear, really. It was also during a global pandemic. My daughter was very young. It was a crazy
Right.
time. So it was not a good time to kind of jump. But it was the time, it was, I think, the great resignation when a lot of people were moving jobs. And in retrospect, that would have actually been a good time to make a move. But yeah, so I'm kind of rambling. But if I were to summarize, I would say having less fear and career wise, jumping and trusting that the net will appear. And you and I have talked about it. Whenever you work for a company, you're not guaranteed employment for life. It's at will employment. Things will always change with the company. And even if you're perfectly happy, things might change anyway. So it's
Right.
good to kind of stay alert, keep an eye out, and take more risks, because I think our human brains are designed to protect us from risk, right? We kind of overestimate the downside and underestimate the upside. But
Oh gosh.
every time I've something good has happened in my life, something amazing, is when I took a massive risk, moved to another country without a plan, went to business school in a country where I didn't speak the language,
Mhm.
left a very comfortable job at Skype to go to Google, unknown large company, which is not quite my thing, and it worked out really well. And Skype ended up being sold to Microsoft. So whenever I've taken a big risk, it's paid off. And if it doesn't pay off, you just get another job. It's not a
Try
big
again.
deal.
Try again. That's fantastic advice, I think, probably for everyone, looking for that stasis. I really love the perspective of overestimating the risk, but underestimating the opportunity, and really finding that middle ground there of, what does reality look like, and, then how to maximize it. So that's phenomenal. One of the other questions that I traditionally ask is, if you could wave a magic wand, or push a button, and take yourself back, 20 or 30 years, and maybe even further back than that, you decide. But what advice would you give your younger self, in terms of just success?
I would say, and I see this with kind of younger people entering the workforce, is people who are good students, who get good grades and do their homework. They tend to do well and get great jobs. But then once you get into a job, you almost need to do the opposite. So rather than kind of waiting to be told what to do, or be given kind of a list of homework or tasks, you need to adopt an owner mindset, a leader mindset, where sure, you might be in charge of a very small thing. I remember Meg Whitman talking about how her first job at PG&E was designing some sort of spout for detergent. And she said, I was going to design the best spout they've ever seen. It could be a small thing, but if you take ownership of that particular project and think about, okay, what is the result I want to achieve? What do I need to happen? What issues might happen? I think that is a very helpful mindset. And for me personally, it took me a couple years in the workforce to adopt that mindset. I was kind of
Yeah.
still doing my homework. And I think what happens is people think that younger people kind of think that if they do everything that they're assigned, if they complete their assignments, then that's all that's required. But really, the way you get rewarded in an organization with promotions or pay or whatever is with getting certain results. It's not
Mhm.
with I was here 9 to 5 and I completed my tasks.
Right.
In some roles that's the case, but in a lot of these kind of professional career building roles, you are being rewarded for the results that you achieve.
Yeah.
So in addition to doing all the tasks, so to speak, that's just table stakes. You need to also think about, where am I going with this project? What is the strategic mission it's trying to accomplish? What else can I do? How can I build on this? Who do I need to loop in? You need to think of it as a business owner, as a
Mm.
leader.
I love that advice. I love that, unconditionally love that advice. There's no caveats or asterisks here. Take ownership, be proactive. This is what I've heard you say. Be proactive, take ownership, have a leadership and an ownership mentality. And then I think one of the keys that make all of this work together, from my perspective of what you said there, was this idea of think bigger, think about the future state, think about where the thing is going. When I think about younger folks today, I see them be very task oriented, and it's not that it's wrong. It's a good place to start, but to get out of a task orientation and into what I call a mission orientation. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to get done? That's probably one of the best pieces of advice I think younger folks could consider and contemplate in their own lives today. So thank you for that. And then the last question is, if somebody were, thinking about partnerships, and in your case, enterprise level, world-class level partnerships as a career choice, what advice or perspective would you give them for success?
That's a good question. I mean, I think first I would think about, am I the right personality type for this? Because
Uh-huh.
I don't think it suits everybody. Obviously, anybody can be successful at anything if they put their mind to it, but it just
Yep.
comes more naturally to ENTPs, for example. So just thinking about, why do I want to do this? Why do I think I would be good at it? I would think, I mean, tactically, I would also talk to a few people who have done these types of partnerships to understand why they like it and why they've been successful at
Mm,
it. And in terms of getting better at it, I would think about the elements of it, right? So one big element of it is strategy, because these types of partnerships fit into the company strategy. They're long term, expensive in terms of time and money. I would think about negotiations. Do you enjoy negotiations? Because that's a big part of it. And execution, right? So
mhm.
conceiving an idea is one thing, but execution is where 50% of the things happen, right? Like
Right.
chasing down the final pieces and kind of making the go to market plan happen. So I think I would think about those three categories. And if somebody enjoys that, they enjoy strategy, they enjoy building something, they enjoy negotiations, and they feel like they're a real go getter and they like to get stuff done and they're strong in execution, I think it's one of the best careers you could have out there.
Yeah.
It's the most
Yeah.
rewarding.
Awesome. Anya, thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights, your wisdom, a little peek under the hood in terms of world-class global partnerships and what that looks like. I so appreciate your time today and appreciate you for being here.
Thank you so much, Jeff. You're a great interviewer.
Oh, thank you. We'll see you next time.